This is the first panel today with the wonderfully open-ended title, The Future of Governance. We have three scholars, three panelists here who will come at this question from very different perspectives. I've polled them very briefly about what they're going to talk about, but I'll keep the surprise for their presentations. And we'll go in the order that is on the conference agenda. The first speaker will be my colleague Curtis Milhaupt from the law school, who's the Baxter-Visa International Professor of Law and a senior fellow at Freeman Spogli Institute. And he's primarily a specialist on corporate law. And he's done a lot of work on Japan, but we'll be talking about China today. Second is Kathryn Stoner, a political scientist, a Russia expert, the director of the Center for Democracy, Development, and Rule of Law, senior fellow by courtesy at CSAC, Center for International Security and Cooperation. And she'll be talking about the myth of authoritarian competence, which sounds like a great theme. And finally, Gita Wirjawan, former Minister of Trade and former chairman of the Investment Coordinating Board of the Republic of Indonesia, founder of the Ancora Group, and visiting scholar this year at Shorenstein, APARC at Stanford. And he'll be coming at this question from the perspective of Southeast Asia. So without further delay, Curtis.
Okay, good morning. I'm going to show a few slides. It's easier to talk about this with some visuals. I'm very honored to be part of this celebration of APARC's founding, and also to be a member of FSI. I'm relatively new to Stanford, and this is a big honor for me. As Andy mentioned, my field is corporate governance, and I first went to Japan as a college student about the time that APARC was founded, and I've spent my professional career focused on primarily on corporate governance in East Asia. So today I'm going to talk about China and what I see as an evolution in Chinese state capitalism, which I think, and particularly the intensification of party-state influence over the business sector. And I think this has significant implications potentially for the domestic economy in China, for China's international economic relationships, and also ultimately perhaps tying into Kathryn's theme for the attractiveness of state capitalism itself. So just a starting point is that we can be misled by ownership in China, and the dichotomy between a state-owned enterprise and a private enterprise. That dichotomy has always been very blurry in China. The state sector is enormous in China, and it's unlikely that bureaucrats in Beijing can actually exercise effective control over the state sector. And I'll show you some evidence of that in a minute. But at the same time, as we know, China is not a rule of law state. China is not an ordinary regulator. And so it has the ability, particularly through the omnipresence of the party, to reach out and touch anyone, including important figures in the private sector, as illustrated by Jack Ma's travails over time. So this has always been a blurry line. The story I'm going to tell you very briefly is that this line has become even blurrier over time. Now, here, just visually, one of the most striking things, and for I think some kind of threatening aspects of Chinese corporate governance, is the fact that there are two structures of corporate governance. On the left side, you have the Western-oriented system of corporate governance. This would be familiar to any corporate lawyer, any investor. This is just standard corporate governance, with the shareholders at the top acting through a shareholders meeting, appointing a board of directors to run the firm, and then the directors appointing senior management. But in China, there's a parallel governance structure provided by the Communist Party. And so in Leninist fashion, the party shadows the business sector in the same way that it shadows the government and the organs of the state. And so all large firms in China have an internal Communist Party committee. The role of that committee may vary from firm to firm, but one of the key aspects of this committee is that the top managers of large Chinese firms wear two hats. They wear a corporate hat as a senior executive, but they also wear a party hat. as a party secretary or deputy party secretary. And so there is a combination or confluence of business and politics in a Chinese firm that is quite literally unheard of in the rest of the world. And I think this is one of the reasons for the suspicion or concern about Chinese enterprises in their operations globally. So I'm going to go through some slides, just hit some highlights. There's a lot of information here, but this is basically an outline of my talk. And this is the illustration of the way that the party is intensifying its influence in corporate governance in China. A party building policy, this was introduced in 2015 under Xi Jinping to elevate and to formalize the role of these party committees in Chinese corporate governance. A corporate social credit system, which is parallel to a system you've probably already read about, which is the social credit system for individuals in China. So every business in China is tracked with respect to its so-called trustworthiness as a market actor. The more recent development is that the party state is now taking so-called special management shares in private enterprises, particularly in the internet realm. These are, in effect, golden shares that carry special rights for the government. And then finally, the proliferation of what are, in effect, state-backed venture capital funds in China. So the combination of these various policies is, as I said, intensification and proliferation of party-state influence into the business sector with, I think, really quite uncertain implications for the domestic economy in China. So very briefly, on the party-building policy, so this was a policy announced in 2015 by the highest levels of the party and the government, which was a mandatory policy for all state-owned enterprises to amend their corporate charters to introduce the following list of 10 provisions. Now, we don't have to go into too much detail. My co-author, Yuxin Lin from the City University of Hong Kong, and I grouped the provisions substantively. So if you look, for example, at S1, well, this one just says that a state-owned enterprise should reference the Communist Party charter in its own corporate charter. No big deal, purely symbolic. But take a look at, for example, D1 and D2. It says that the board of directors of a Chinese company, SOE, or the senior management should first consult with the party committee before taking a major decision. Now, this completely upends standard corporate governance principles in which the board is the senior decision-making or strategic body in a corporation. Or take a look at P1. The party has the ability to nominate senior directors. Again, taking that power away from the board of directors. So some of these provisions are extraordinarily substantive. So by scraping the web, we looked at all of the approximately 3,400 public companies in China, A-share listed companies, to determine which ones had amended their charters at all to comply with this policy, and then to look at which specific provisions they had actually enacted. So what we saw is we divided first by ownership structure, SOEs versus private firms. What's interesting here on the left side, you see that not all SOEs adopted any provisions. Now remember, this is a mandatory policy directed at SOEs. Some of them never adopted any of these provisions, suggesting that some powerful SOEs have the ability to push back against policies that they don't like. Look at the right side. In this first period, these early adopters, 6% of private firms adopted provisions elevating the party committee into their governance structure, even though this policy was not directed at the private sector. In fact, my co-author and I could not even find a suggestion, a public suggestion, that private firms should adopt these provisions. So it suggests, again, the blurriness of this line. Many private firms in China were willing to accede to party control or influence in their governance. If you see here, 25% of these early adopters adopted provisions actually giving substantive influence in corporate governance into these firms. Even if we look at the later period, if we look at the entire period from 2015 to 22, a third of private companies in China have now amended their charters to give some level of influence of the party into their corporate governance. Very briefly, this is a look at which provisions were actually adopted. This is kind of blurry, but this is symbolic. decision-making and personnel. So you see only half of the state-owned sectors were willing to accede to the party in terms of substantive corporate governance. Again, this is a mandatory policy for the SOEs. It suggests the ability of SOEs to push back and to resist the influence of the party. So one of the stories that I'm telling is significant heterogeneity among Chinese firms. Policymakers in DC these days like to paint with a broad brush and to assume that all Chinese firms are in some sense agents of the party. This research suggests a much more complicated picture. If we look at private firms, we see that today 70% of private firms have amended their corporate charters in some way to give some level of influence to the party. Although, as you see in the bottom here, the percentage now of private firms that have given true substantive influence to the party is still relatively low. But nonetheless, I think it's a picture of significant heterogeneity. Second policy I want to talk about very briefly is the corporate social credit system. Extremely ambitious, data-driven project to rate the quote-unquote trustworthiness of every business in China. So, as I said, massive data project to accumulate data initially on what is known as public credit information. This is data that's generated by a corporation's interactions with courts, regulators, and other government bodies. Has a firm paid its taxes? Has it repaid loans, et cetera? Eventually, market credit information will also be compiled based on interactions with the private sector. So Zhejiang province is the first one to publicly roll out the data. So every business in China has a public credit identifier, like a social security number. You can look up, at least for those firms that are now public, you can look up their credit identifier. So my co-author, again, Yuxin Ling of Hong Kong University and I, or City University of Hong Kong rather, have looked at the first publicly available data from Zhejiang. This covers about 500 public companies headquartered in Zhejiang. And all of the companies will be scored according to these various categories, most of which I think are self-explanatory. What we determine is that politically connected firms, and I'll be happy to say more about what that means or the variable that we've used there, politically connected firms receive higher scores in this corporate social credit system, all else being equal, than non-politically connected firms. The mechanism for that is a so-called social responsibility category. There's a lot of information here. These are the subcategories of the scoring. What you see is that overall, companies scored very highly across these various categories. Again, at least in this initial publicly available data. However, if we look at the social responsibility category, scores are much lower. This category measures awards from the government and the party and contributions by corporations to party-backed causes. So this is an alignment with Xi Jinping's Common Prosperity Campaign, and it's designed to encourage corporations to make donations. And what we find is that politically connected firms score higher in this social responsibility category, and that's the channel for those firms receiving higher scores overall. Now, what's the difference in terms of the scores? A lot of economic benefits or detriments or demerits are linked to a firm's social credit score. So higher scoring firms get audited less frequently. They get special access to loans, et cetera. Companies that score poorly can be essentially blacklisted from the economy. So a lot turns on this, and it's going to be very interesting to see how this social credit system for corporations is rolled out over the future. It's still just in its rollout phase. Okay, so very briefly, there's a couple of other points here. As I mentioned, the party state is transforming itself into an investor. It is taking, in effect, golden shares with veto rights in particularly internet companies. These shares come with a board seat and veto rights over important corporate transactions. Also a chief editor to monitor the content of Chinese internet firms. So it's part of China's censorship apparatus. And then finally, the proliferation of so-called guidance funds. These are, in effect, state-backed venture capital funds that are both trying to generate a return, but also trying to align startups with Chinese industrial policy. You see huge amount of capital that they have amassed. And so the story, I think, that is being painted to some extent by these by these data and policies are a transformation of Chinese state capitalism, what you might think of as state capitalism 1.0, focused on large, massive state-owned enterprises and national champions, to a more widespread, intensified, internalized mechanisms of governance proliferating into private firms. And so I'll just end again, there's quite a bit of literature that is developing this idea. And I'll just end very briefly just by highlighting the implications here. Obviously, this is a story that, whose outcome is still uncertain. But a few questions, can China continue to grow and innovate with a highly politicized or increasingly politicized form of corporate governance? Obviously, this has intensified suspicion over Chinese firms and their global activities, particularly in the United States. And then finally, I think depending largely on the success or lack of success of this new version of Chinese capitalism, it's going to have a big impact on how people view the attractiveness of state capitalism itself. So thank you very much. I look forward to questions going forward.
Thank you, Curtis. Kathryn.
So first, congratulations, Shorenstein APARC, on your 40th birthday. We're your younger sister, I guess, on the first floor. I have the honor of being the Mosbacher director of the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law, as Andy mentioned. And we just celebrated our 20th anniversary. And Giwak, we had no tent. We had no tables with tablecloths. So at our 40th CDDRL, we'll do that. We had jackets, but other than that. So thank you. This is actually going to fit nicely together, I think. I'm moving into a post-PowerPoint world. I think PowerPoint is great. Like power, it corrupts. Corrupts absolutely. So I'm going to ask you to follow my words, my voice, I guess. So Curtis ended with a question of attractiveness of authoritarian governance as he outlined a rather impressive set of controls, administrative controls really, that the Communist Party has developed for state-owned enterprises and I guess even some sort of quasi-state-owned enterprises. I'm going to provide a contrast to you, which is Russia. Andy mentioned I'm a Russia specialist and actually now banned from Russia, which I suppose is a badge of honor these days. But what the remarks I'll make briefly here are based on a paper that just came out in the Journal of Democracy that's called The Myth of Putin, which is a terrible title because it's not about the myth of Putin. It's actually about the myth of authoritarian governing competence. And the case is Russia. So by competence and governance, I mean getting policy done, making people's lives markedly and measurably better. I had originally titled that paper, Making Autocracy Worse. And it was a spin on Making Democracy Work, which was a book written by Robert Putnam at Harvard, gosh, probably 20 or 30 years ago now, about the contrast between northern and southern Italy and regional governments, some being able to provide public goods and services far better than others. That is, take the trash out, have clean water, have teachers show up in schools, that sort of thing. He was actually my dissertation advisor, and he suggested when I did a study of local governments in graduate school, local governments in Russia, he suggested I call it Making Democracy Worse because they weren't governing that well. So I thought it was funny to call this paper Making Autocracy Worse because what Putin has done has, over time, is become a less competent manager of Russia. And especially since the beginning of the war in Ukraine, which began in February of last year, has actually worsened Russian autocracy, not by the administrative controls that, frankly, are rather impressive. I'm not suggesting that they're a good idea. The Chinese ones that Curtis just painted out, Russia has none of that. It's pretty void of institutions that could in any sense match or rival what the Communist Party has developed in China. in terms of governance and in terms of social control. So I think what we represent this morning is actually different autocratic governing strategies and, in my case, survival strategies. I think Russia is an appropriate country to talk about, although APARC don't move out of your lane, because it really is Eurasia. I always get to tell China specialists, the country I study is bigger than yours, even as they boast about the size of the Chinese population and, of course, its economy relative to Russia's. But Russia is the largest country in the world. It has traditionally, through imperial times and the Soviet period, been very difficult to govern, in part because of its size, spanning 13 time zones, 83 now subnational governments, all in one country, 121 different ethnicities. The bottom line of this paper is basically how governance in Russia over time has worsened, and as Putin's autocracy has become less and less able to get a form of performance legitimacy for social compliance by actually improving people's lives, it has become more and more repressive. And in the last year, this has gone off a cliff in terms of heightening repression. So the bottom line up front is that the victims of Russia's invasion of Ukraine are, of course, first and foremost Ukrainians. The war has reversed at least 15 years of developmental progress in Ukraine. As of March, there were 8,150,230 refugees from Ukraine scattered across Europe, 8,317 dead civilians in the last year, over 5 million, almost 6 million internally displaced Ukrainians as of March. The World Bank recently estimated that it'll cost $411 billion to repair Ukraine, and that's about 2.5 times its GDP from last year. So Ukraine is obviously the victim of Russia's invasion. But this invasion has reversed much of the progress in Russian political and economic development since the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 as well. The economy has declined rapidly, although not as rapidly as those governments that have imposed sanctions on Russia's economy had anticipated or hoped for. In 2022, though, it did have the biggest decline away from democracy of any country in the world, declining 22 points to 146th place of 167 countries measured by the Economist Intelligence Democracy Rankings. So as this has happened, and as the military has underperformed or performed increasingly badly in Russia, the quality of Russian autocracy has worsened. That is, it's become more reliant on repression or fear rather than just controlling a narrative of Russia under siege. And this is in contrast to the way many scholars had begun to regard Russia and Putin's autocracy, and that is one that was sort of a modern autocracy, in that it wasn't like Stalin's autocracy. Putin relied more on controlling information. Some called it an informational dictatorship, reliant on spin more than fear. And Putinism was supposed to be the gold standard of this. So if you went and walked around on the streets of Moscow or St. Petersburg or Sverdlovsk, you wouldn't feel as though you were living in a highly repressive regime. Instead, people went about their daily lives. Things were basically stable. The narrative was that Russia's problems were not Putin's fault. It is because we are a country under siege. The West is stopping us. But it is no longer simply a spin or informational dictatorship, and does not have the administrative capacity that Curtis painted out, just a part of what the Chinese party state can do. Russia is not that at all anymore. And so what we see in Russia is a decline in autocratic governing competence, and the war has made this worse and sort of lays it bare, and an increase in repression. Now, Putin had options. This wasn't the only one that is becoming more repressive. He could have done what we just saw Erdogan do in Turkey, which is hand out patronage to those who work for the state. increasing just before an election, for example, as he did, their salaries. He could have tried to build a true administrative apparatus, a true party, in the way that, at least the aspects that Curtis just painted out, President Xi has done, but he's not done that. He could have intensified the narrative. He's partly done that, of Russia under siege. We are fighting for our motherland. They are fascists in Ukraine, backed by the fascist. We're both fascist and overly liberal in the West, and permissive, so we're both apparently. But when all else fails, and the narrative can't be kept away from people of what is truly happening, because if sons who are fighting in Ukraine come home dead, you can't anymore convince someone that they can't believe what they see in front of their eyes. What they see in front of their eyes is dead soldiers, right? And so we have estimates recently of Russian dead coming back at about 100,000. We don't know the true number, but there are some good numbers that are collected very meticulously by various international organizations, and actually Russian organizations operating outside of Russia, that go through local newspapers to look at obituaries and notices of funerals to help get some kind of count. And so there's an estimate that it's somewhere around 100,000 dead soldiers since the start of this conflict. And so what is the response? Well, partly it's to increase social services, especially to the poor. Those are the folks whose kids are being asked now to go into the military, although Russia has a professional contract military, not a purely conscript army anymore. But it is the poorer people who take up those contracts because the military pays, usually. Instead of reverting to administrative controls, although Putin has done some of that over time, or spin alone, there is now fear. And so we might ask why Russians don't protest. Well, they have protested. Actually, about 14,600 of them were arrested in the first 4 weeks of the war last year for protesting. And so that's one of many reasons we don't see as many Russians out on the street anymore. There are draconian punishments for even standing in Red Square with a blank piece of paper, because the implication is that that paper might really mean to say something like no war. So this was not Russia in 2005 when Freedom House first named it a consolidated autocracy, and yet its score on many of these measures really hasn't changed very much. So we may measure differences in democracy much better than we measure differences in autocracy. But this paper and my remarks today are really about governance, right? And so Putin did have a certain performance legitimacy, especially in his first 2 terms as president between 2000 and 2008, when the Russian economy grew 7%. This is how I act out the GDP, grew 7% year on year. And that was largely, although not only, on the back of growing oil prices and the revenues that trickled into the economy. But Russia's not a traditionally resource-cursed state in that it wasn't borrowing money when the price and revenues from oil dropped. Instead, it created an investment fund and some rules around the investment fund, and it began to run budget surpluses rather than deficits. People saw their real incomes increase, sometimes double and triple in these boom years. But then we all went through the global economic crisis that began in the fall of 2008. Russia dipped even further than the rest of us, partly because there was less demand for some of its big exports, including oil and gas, but fertilizer, aluminum, a lot of other things that Russia makes, weapons as well. But there was some good macroeconomic policy that pulled Russia out of recession. That wasn't Putin alone. And so it's almost despite Putin and despite his known propensity to steal from the state and to set up opportunities for his cronies to steal from the state. the economy recovered and began to grow again, but never again hit those high growth rates of 2003 to 2008. And so what we saw as first, just prior to the seizure of Crimea in 2014, was a dip in public approval for Putin. And we saw, and it goes up somewhat as there's a rally around the flag after that. But then it begins to go down again over COVID, which was also mismanaged in Russia. People showed very low levels of trust for their government over COVID and over their vaccine in particular. And the healthcare system, its corruption, its inefficiencies and inadequacies were pretty much laid bare, and Russia had a very, very high morbidity rate from COVID, although they were able to hide that for a while because comorbidities, so if you had cancer and also got COVID, that was not counted as a COVID death, that's counted as a cancer death. So that underreporting made things look okay, but unmistakably, people noticed that their relatives were dying much faster than in the past. So this created some vulnerabilities with Putin. We see his approval rating dip to below 59%. He tries to make some desperate changes in the Constitution, and that's where we start to see autocratization really double down. And so what's happened is he's gone from performance legitimacy and a certain governing competence under autocracy to declining performance legitimacy, and there's no model to increase performance. I promised I wouldn't do slides, but so you'll have to trust me that Russia underperformed in terms of foreign investment, and obviously this has become even worse since the beginning of the war with companies pulling out. We have about 1,200 international companies that have either ceased operations or pulled out completely from Russia. Now the Russian government is threatening to take over their assets as we take over the assets of at least one oligarch and try to transfer those into a fund to rebuild Ukraine. In the face of increasing news out of Ukraine and the obvious fact that the war was not short and sweet, there was not a quick takeover, the president of Ukraine, Zelensky, did not leave Ukraine as had been anticipated by the Russians when they initially invaded. The Ukrainian military was not the Ukrainian military of 2014. They did not put down their weapons when the Russians asked them to. And it turns out Ukrainians themselves didn't greet Russian invaders with bouquets of flowers, as had been anticipated by Mr. Putin, but instead with Molotov cocktails. They didn't want to be freed from this supposed fascism in Ukraine by Russians. And as the war has now dragged into its 15th month, this is a crisis of legitimacy, performance legitimacy, and governing capacity for Mr. Putin. And so his reaction has been to become ever more repressive as a result. So there are popular arguments that could, challenge this. Why would Russia be anything but an autocracy, is what a historian would say. It's always been one, so why would it ever change? Well, you could say that about any country that is a democracy today, right? Before it became a democracy, it was an autocracy. And there's no, genetic allergy in Russia to freedom. They're fine with freedom. But, a lot of people like order and stability as well. And they didn't have that in the 90s, and increasingly they don't have that today. You could say that it's because of the resource curse that Russia's bound to be an autocracy, and it inevitable that it would become more repressive over time, just as resource-cursed countries tend to be. But Russia's actually not a resource-cursed economy. It sells a lot of other things. So we hear about oil and gas, and yes, those are big revenue sources for the Russian budget. But they're not the only revenue sources for the Russian budget. It has a manufacturing industry. It actually does sell things. It's just that you don't buy them at Target or Walmart or wherever you shop, right? Unless you're looking to buy, a nuclear power plant or advanced weapons systems or aluminum or fertilizer or any number of other things that they sell. and provide to, in particular, low-income countries. I think we're all acutely aware now that Russia is actually the world's biggest grain or wheat exporter, too, especially in poorer countries. Putin has not always been anti-Western, anti-liberal. And it isn't just his KGB past. This has evolved over time. He was the first leader to call George W. Bush after 9/11 to express his condolences and looked forward. And you might, well, you don't do it now because I'm speaking, but you could Google up and see pictures of him with a cowboy hat on next to George Bush, clearing brush in Texas on his ranch. And you remember those infamous words Bush said, I looked him in the eye and saw his soul, right? It's a man we could work with. So he hasn't always been that way. It's really changed in the last 10 years and the last year in particular as his governing legitimacy and lack of ability to produce big positive changes in people's lives. He has reverted to fear. So really, the myth of authoritarian governing competence has exploded with the Ukrainian conflict and Russia's failure to perform as anticipated in the Ukrainian conflict. And so I'll just finish with this, Andy, I see you. First of all, authoritarian regimes, as Steve Kotkin, who I know is a senior fellow at APARC, has said, and was my colleague at Princeton for years before, authoritarian regimes, Steve has asserted, can fail at all things but one: suppressing dissent and political alternatives. And that's the one thing that Putin has been very successful at doing. So high repressive capacity, but increasingly low administrative capacity, corruption. We see it in the Russian military, and we see the result of that. That is but one bureaucracy, a huge one within Russia that performs poorly as well. So it's no longer enough to create simply a perception of governing competence, spin a narrative, changing the informational environment, and an inability to actually govern better, especially as Russia is under increasingly difficult sanctions, has meant that Putin has now had to resort increasingly to fear, not having the administrative capacity in any way, shape, or form to govern in the way that China does under Xi. And so he has made autocracy more repressive in Russia and therefore far worse. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Kathryn. That worked very well without PowerPoint.
Well, I just want to say I'm honored to be up here. And I want to say happy birthday to APARC. And may the next 40 years be of greater health and prosperity. I want to talk about governance and the future of governance in the context of where I come from. And I come from a country called Indonesia, which is part of Southeast Asia, which is continuing to be one of the most underrated regions in the world, in spite of the fact that it is a population of roughly around 700 million, a collective GDP of $3.5 trillion, much bigger than some of the other countries or economies that get talked about, including Russia, very frequently. And I think it boils down to how we need to actually focus a lot more on governance. And when we take a look at Southeast Asia, which is a group of 10 countries or 10 economies, 4 of which are monarchies. One of the 4 monarchies is an absolute monarchy, which is called Brunei. The others are monarchical places that are sort of like trying to be more democratic. And then there's 2 other countries that are one political party system, Vietnam and Laos. And the others are countries that have been thriving relatively well as democracies, one of which is Indonesia, which is the 4th largest economy, 4th largest population in the world, 3rd largest democracy in the world. Just got a good taste of democratization in 1998, during which a lot of pundits around the world pontificated that we were just going to balkanize and go down the drain. But in spite of all that, I think we've done pretty okay as a democratic state. We've been able to build our economy moderately, but not to the scale that we would have hoped for, not to the scale that some other countries in Asia have done in the last 23 years since we democratized in the late 90s. Now, there are different ways of defining governance, right, amongst the world members, but also amongst the members of Southeast Asia. I think one in Laos would define governance very differently from one in Cambodia, one in Indonesia, one in Singapore. But I think it's safe to say that within Southeast Asia, the way we see governance is really with regards to the degree to which we view somebody, some institution, something as trustworthy, right? And that's manifested in the way the leadership speaks, acts, and the way the governance speaks and or acts. And I want to try to put this in a much more concrete economic context. Within Southeast Asia, we take a look at some of the economic metrics. The first one I want to go through with is foreign direct investment, which Kathryn had alluded to. In a context of the world which is abundant with liquidity at around $100 trillion, Southeast Asia in the last 5 to 10 years has only been able to get collectively about $200 to $250 billion, which is peanuts, right, in the context of the $100 trillion worth of liquidity, most of which would have been sitting in negative interest rate environments in Japan and Western European countries until about 12 months ago when Jay Powell started jacking up interest rates. And if you peel the onion a little bit more, within the context of that $250 billion that's basically attracted by Southeast Asia collectively, then you get a good sense of where governance is. Singapore has been able to get about $105 billion out of the $200 to $250 billion. And the remaining would be distributed sort of unequally to the remaining 9 countries. And if you take a look at the FDI on a per capita per year basis, Singapore does it at a rate of about $19,000 per capita per year in terms of FDI. As compared to the other countries, call them the big guns of Thailand, Vietnam, Malaysia, the Philippines, and Indonesia, they're getting FDI at a rate of only $100 to $400 on a per capita per year basis, as compared to Singapore that's been able to get $19,000. Just remarkably higher than the other big guns of Southeast Asia. And, a reflex would basically say that, well, it's a small country. But the small country argument collapses as soon as you figure out that Singapore was able to get $105 billion of FDI in 2021. The next biggest recipient of FDI in Southeast Asia got only $30 billion. That was Indonesia with a population of 280 million, Singapore with a population of 5.5 million. And you start wondering, right? How is it that Singapore has been able to get disproportionately larger amount of FDI as compared to the other Southeast Asian countries? So then I started hypothesizing that the way capital formation takes place is not a function of ideology. It's not a function of geography. It's not a function of whether or not there are natural resources. But it's a function of how much you trust this individual, this entity, this country, this economy. And I think Singapore has been able to embrace certain attributes that are, I think, really good manifestation of governance. And it starts at the leadership, and it starts at the governance, or people that report to the leadership, be it in entrepreneurship, in policy and politics, in NGOs, and all that good stuff. And if you read the Bible of the PAP, there's only 3 words that keep getting mentioned from chapter 1 to the last chapter. It's really about competence, about integrity, and about accountability. And I think Lee Kuan Yew has been able to consistently not only deliver those attributes, but consistently make sure that anybody that would join the train would have to embrace those three attributes. I may sound like the marketing director of the great Singapore corporation, but I want to make the point that Southeast Asia, I think, has been a region of peace and stability. It has shown great ability of learning from each other. And that's why we've been able to embrace the culture of pragmatism as to stay peaceful and stable for the last 2,000 years. And the next economic metric is trade. You take a look at Singapore, it trades at a ratio of higher, if not much higher than 100%, vis-a-vis its GDP, whereas the other Southeast Asian countries trade with themselves and with the rest of the world at a ratio of between 30 to 60%. It just shows that the other countries of Southeast Asia can't show the wherewithal the way Singapore has in terms of connecting with the rest of the world in the context of goods and services, and also people. We call that social mobility. And a third metric is really borrowing. I mean, if you take a look at most of the countries in Southeast Asia, they borrow at a moderate rate of only 40 to 70% of their respective GDPs, whereas Singapore borrows at about 100% of its GDP. But it's been able to show to the world that it can service its indebtedness. It's been rated AAA. By way of its being rated AAA, it can actually show great debt serviceability. That, I think, is something that the other Southeast Asian countries have sort of, like, this is something that I think we need to learn a little bit more. I'm not trying to point out here that borrowing is good. What I'm trying to point out is that these economic metrics, be it FDI, be it trade, be it borrowing, are actually metrics that manifest the degree to which a country can be trusted. The fourth metric, which I think is quite key about Singapore, is that it has consistently positioned itself as an intersection of ideas, as a place that knows how to project soft power and ideas to the other 9 countries in Southeast Asia and to the rest of the world. The most concrete example of this is that if you live in Washington, or if you live in London, you live in Tokyo, you live in Beijing, you want to know something about Southeast Asia, the first person you call is a Singaporean. Not somebody from Brunei, not somebody from Cambodia, not somebody from Indonesia. As much as Indonesia represents 43% of the region's economy, it represents 43% of the region's population, you tend to think intuitively, let me call the Singaporean girl. She would know what Southeast Asia is all about. And that, I think, has been a reflection of how Singapore has been able to invest in governance. So I would argue that Southeast Asia is differential in the way it views governance, in the way it invests in governance, in the way it manifests governance. But Southeast Asia is sort of like blessed with one member that I think has been able to show good examples. And I say this with full cognizance of the fact that Singapore has been criticized for not giving space and voice to the opposition, to the media. But I would counter that in saying that Singapore has been so damn good in distributing the other essential public goods, inclusive of healthcare, welfare, intellect, integrity, moral value, and social value, that I think other Southeast Asian countries that have been bragging about being good democracies, but they've really sucked in distributing these essential public goods. So those are the metrics that we use to measure governance in the context of Southeast Asia. And here comes the set of headwinds for Southeast Asia. I think the first is what I call the paradox of the democratization of information vis-a-vis that of ideas. We've gotten a good taste of internet that has been so good in allowing for the democratization of information. We've seen how the internet has been so good at not allowing us to democratize ideas. If any, it has polarized ideas. To the point you've got echo chambers on this side of the spectrum and that side of the spectrum not being able to communicate to each other. And this is not uniquely developing economy or a developing country. This is pretty pervasively across the world. And I've gotten a good taste of that, where I have not been able to sit in a room to agree to disagree. And I think the culture of being able to agree to disagree should be preserved and harnessed. And as a result of this being a fundamental headwind, I think this will have repercussions on how we nurture governance in the future. The second headwind is really with respect to education and how we educate the kids and the grandkids in the future. You know, there is only one Indonesian every year that joins Stanford as an undergraduate. There's about 25 to 30 from Singapore. And if you talk to the Singaporean, they seem to be of the view that there should be 100 more from Singapore. I don't want to get into this messy debate about reverse discrimination, but if you take a look at the US, all over the campuses in the US, there's only 8,500 Indonesians. There's 350 to 450,000 Chinese, 200,000 Indians, 150,000 Koreans. We can go into the discussion of how many of these guys get what percentages of the H-1B every year. You would have a better idea, and we had a great discussion on this. Indonesia is underrepresented, and so are the other countries of Southeast Asia. So this is one element that I think Southeast Asia needs to be resolute about. And thankfully, we've got a much larger fiscal and monetary spaces, to the point we can afford this. Just to give you an idea, in the 80s when I came here for schooling, there were about 16,000 Indonesians, and that's declined to about 8,500. As much as one would think that there's been some rotational behavior with respect to Indonesians now going to Singapore, Malaysia, Australia, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and China because of proximity. But I don't quite buy the rotational behavior. I buy the argument that we need to place as many of our fellow Southeast Asians in places where we can actually learn about technological innovation. We can learn about social science. We can learn to be better citizens of the world. The other subtext of this educational headwind is PISA. PISA is a measurement of how the 15-year-olds basically have proficiency in language and STEM. There's only 2 countries in Southeast Asia that have scored above the global average. First one is Singapore. That's ranked number 2 in the world. China is number 1. And there's a second Southeast Asian country that's been hungry to move itself up. It's called Vietnam. So Singapore and Vietnam now are at above the global average of PISA, whereas the other 8 are well below. So this is, I think, something that we all Southeast Asians got to take a view on. And I'm a big, believer of what the Singaporeans and what the Koreans have done. Lee Kuan Yew, has always said, if you want to create great products of education, you invest in teachers. And Singapore has been consistent in recruiting people from the top 20% of educational domains to teach. And there is empirical evidence here that suggests or even proves that if you recruit somebody from the top 20% of an academic domain to teach, he or she can teach within a year, about a year and a half's worth of teaching. But if you recruit somebody from the bottom 20%, he or she can only teach about 6 months' worth of teaching in a year. Unfortunately, most countries in Southeast Asia have been investing in the bottom 20 percentile. Korea, I think, does it a little more extremely. They invest in the top 5%, not the top 20%. So there's clear examples in Asia that we can actually copycat from. And it's all about whether or not we have the money, whether or not we have the fiscal space, whether or not we have the monetary space. The third headwind is really how we have become multipolar. And inevitably, multipolarity translates into revisionist tendencies, right? Inevitably, there is going to be more and more people around the world that may have a different view about what democratization should be like. And I think this is a headwind that we all need to be sensitive to, and we need to be open-minded about how we can become better democracies in Southeast Asia. Rest assured, the DNA of the people of Southeast Asia, we want to be better democracies. There have been episodic stresses in the last 2,000 years, but I can tell you there's only been 9 million people that have died because of frictions of ethnicity, race, and religion in the last 2,000 years. That's a small number compared to the numbers we've seen in World War I and World War II. So to the extent that we can understand better about the revisionism that's prevailing, then I think we have a better chance of reconstructing or reshaping the way governance ought to be. The next headwind is really AI. And I'm a little disturbed. I'm a bit dystopian about how large language models are not being discoursed in a multidisciplinary manner. It's as if the technologists are just wanting to ride this Ferrari and move at 250 miles an hour without taking into account those of culture, of sociology, of environment, of the economy, to be better involved so that there is a much more judicious way forward in terms of how we narrate governance for everybody around the world. And the last bit is TikTok and Instagram. I mean, I struggle to convince my kids to drop off their handphones. They spend 10 hours a day on their mobile phones, and they're looking at, I think, a lot of garbage on Instagram Reels and TikTok. And it took me 5 years to get them to drop their mobile phones when we're having dinner. 5 years. And I'm not the typical draconian Asian tiger father, because I've learned the principles of democracy. I need to do it in a more democratic manner. But until and unless we take a view on this, and I'm glad of the announcement by Montana yesterday about doing something about TikTok, I think we got to do something about this. To the extent we're not regulating this a little bit better, I think we're exposed to a greater risk, if not possibility, of people's attaining a position of leadership by way of festivalizing and or sensationalizing as opposed to intellectualizing. I don't think we're going to see a John F. Kennedy or a Mahatma Gandhi in the next 50 years if people continue spending 10 hours a day on their mobile phones, looking at TikTok and Instagram. And I say this with full sensitivity of the fact that there's great content in those platforms, but there is much and many more bad contents. And not much is being done about it. And we can talk about how China is doing it. I think China is very careful about making sure that only good contents appear on TikTok. So you've got these headwinds that I think Southeast Asians are trying to learn a little bit more about so that we can take a better view of. So what's the conclusion? I'm actually quite pragmatic. At the moment, less than 5% of the Indonesian population speaks English. Less than 10% of Indonesians have passports. How about if we get 100 million people from Indonesia to speak English? By the way, the population is 280. So less than 20 million people speak English. If we get 100 million people of Indonesians to speak English, if we get 50% of the population of Southeast Asia to speak English, or speak Mandarin, or speak any relevant international language, I think there is a better hope of ushering a much more collaborative framework within which we can have a better understanding of each other, within which we can have a much more harmonious way of learning about governance. Is that possible? I think AI can help. I mean, I've been talking to a lot of guys in Silicon Valley about how about if we use AI to make sure that we get 100 million people in Indonesia, we get 350 to 400 million people in Southeast Asia, of the 700 million people in Southeast Asia to be able to speak an international language so that we have a better understanding with the conversations that are ongoing at Stanford University. Most Indonesians have no clue what Stanford is all about, have no clue of what Peking University is all about, have no clue of what Oxford is all about. And I think it's important for them to understand that so that we can go back to the very elements that Lee Kuan Yew has been promoting, the elements of integrity, accountability, and competence. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Gita. You've left laid a lot of issues on the table that actually raised implicit comparative questions with what Curtis and Kathryn talked about. But instead of me pushing the panel in that direction, maybe we can ask for questions from the audience. And if you have questions, there are two microphones in each aisle. So if you have a question, please step up. Our resident Southeast Asianist, Don Emerson.
Yeah, Don Emerson. Andy, I'm going to do what you just declined to do. I'm going to ask two questions of Kathryn, one of which reflects what Gita has just said. The first question for Kathryn is this. I think many are familiar with an argument that suggests that regime change begins with splits in the elite. In that context, would you care to comment on the implications of what Prigozhin is doing? My second question to you is this. If we accept Gita's strong concerns about TikTok, about social media, and the damage that it could bring, does this lead you to think that despite our loyalty to liberal democracy, looking into this century to come, we should be less resistant to the idea of illiberal democracy because censorship will be a critical ingredient in a successful and trustworthy form of governance? Thank you.
Would you like
me to do that?
Up? Yeah.
So so there's this argument that, how do autocracies get taken apart or fall down? So one is from below, right? That's one argument from below, social revolution, looking for people on the streets, and the other is from above, and elite splits. There are a lot of different elite groups in Russia, and so the noisiest person who's not really part of a group per se is Yevgeny Prigozhin, who is also known as Putin's caterer. And he is often named in the popular press here in the West as the founder, quote unquote, of the Wagner Group. He's not really the founder. He's the face of the Wagner Group. And to answer your question, I just have to just very quickly go into his background. So some of you may or may not know that he spent time in jail in the 1990s for a variety of truly criminal things. When he came out, he started a little catering cart. And then he turns this into a restaurant, this restaurant becomes quite popular with Putin and his gang in St. Petersburg. And then Prigozhin starts to cater for the Kremlin when Putin moves into the presidency in the 2000s, and then he gets very lucrative contracts from the defense industry, those prepared packages of food that Russian soldiers, we've seen them leave behind as they've had to vacate various parts of Ukraine. Those are made by Prigozhin, more often than not made by Prigozhin's company. He also has educational contracts, right? So becomes a client over time, but really no background, no KGB background. So that's another group of elites around Putin that is much more powerful than Prigozhin. Prigozhin is kind of a useful idiot. You might wonder, how can it be that a guy with the background that I just described to you be out there fighting and calling military strategy? Well, he's not. He's in Bakhmut fighting. And whether he lives or dies, to be honest, no one really cares, except maybe Mrs. Prigozhin, if there is one. There may be many. So including Putin, right? This is not a valuable asset to him. Why is it that Prigozhin has been allowed to operate the internet research company? You may remember them from the attempts to disrupt our election in 2016. Okay, so it's not because he's a great business person, right? He's put up to this by elements probably of military intelligence. So as I said, he's kind of a useful idiot. Putin uses this kind of person. He's not the first, but he is the most recent, to kick other members of the elite, and in particular, this is the Minister of Defense, Shoigu, who's very close to Putin. Prigozhin is allowed to say things basically to Shoigu that Putin is presumably saying to him behind closed doors, like, "Win, you idiot," right? I would predict that Prigozhin is not long for this world. He's putting himself in a pretty precarious situation by asking for ammunition from the guys with the guns and ammunition. So forget that split as being significant. That one's not significant. There are other ones that are potentially significant, not oligarchs, quote unquote. They're different groups of oligarchs. They're now, because of our sanctions, completely dependent on Putin. So we need to, there's a policy issue there. We need to think about how to create a path out of that, so maybe some of them will defect, if we think that's useful. And then there's the military. Russia doesn't have a history of military coups, as do many countries we've discussed today. A very strong history of civilian control over the military. But and so I wouldn't expect that to come from Shoigu, the defense minister, who actually has no experience in the military, despite his medals. I would expect it lower down, because they're being humiliated and not being allowed to control the war. The FSB is being allowed to control the war, and they don't fight wars. So I'm not optimistic, to be honest, Don. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Sir.
Hi, John Everard. First speaker, Curtis, right?
Yes.
Okay, yes, that was a brilliant presentation. Thank you. I learned much just watching those slides flick up, especially with the good, hard data that you provided. It's rightly reminded that the situation in the party's interaction with governance in both state-owned enterprise and private enterprise in China is actually much more complicated than most people realize.
Yes.
I've been told by Chinese friends that, in fact, there's another layer of complexity here, that although, as you showed in your slides, the party continues to try to put its people into companies with varying levels of success, as you demonstrated, that in fact what happens is that when it gets its members onto company boards, they flip. And to its horror, the party discovers that whereas it thought it was putting its people into the company, what happens is that these people turn into the company's people in the party. And the whole attempt at governance through that mechanism tends to be really quite shambolic. I just wondered whether in your research you'd come across any kind of evidence of how far this is happening and how deep this tendency is.
Well, thank you very much, and thanks for the compliment on the presentation. I mean, the first point you made is, I think, the most important one, which is this is an extraordinarily complicated system. I think policymakers in DC and elsewhere don't understand the complexity of it, and so painting with as broad a brush as the regulators are doing, I mean, I have sympathy for them because you have to write rules that are generally applicable, and yet the Chinese system requires deep knowledge company by company. So I think that's the first point. The second one is, which is as alluded to in your comments, I always marvel at how these top managers actually can do their jobs, because they have to simultaneously be political maestros and also run in many cases, a global Fortune 500 company. I don't know how you do that. And so the brief, it's very hard to research the point that you actually have made. I suspect it occurs. I've had some glimpses of this as an expert witness in some litigation against Chinese companies. And what you see, if you can see internal documents, is the corporate side of these people pushing back against their political masters, because ultimately they're judged on how well the company performs. And that requires business sense and concern for making a profit and not, transmitting Xi Jinping thought down into the company. So I don't have any hard data on this, and it's a very hard thing to research. But anecdotally, yes, it absolutely does occur. And I think this is a very important point to somehow try to get our hands around. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Excuse me.
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I have I'm Tilly. I'm the visiting scholar from the Sky. I have a question for Curtis. How do you think the corporate social credit, the data of this, because the data I found is from the comment or the scoring is from the government and those financial departments that give the credit to those companies. So firstly, how do you think about the reliability of the data? The second, since those comment is from the government, those political collected corporations, they got the higher score from that your
yes.
chart. Yeah, how do you think about that? Thank you.
Well, in terms of the first question, a very good one, which is, where does this data come from? How reliable is it? How well is it centralized and then disseminated to the local governments? This is a big question, and this even though this project has been in the works for about 2 decades, it is only now being rolled out, and it was delayed by COVID. So a lot remains to be seen. This is really a work in progress. One might, suspect one potential possibility for corrupting this system is that the local governments want the local companies to look good in these systems, so they may be falsifying the data or misreporting the data. So that's certainly one possibility. So yes, absolutely, this is a system that will really rise or fall on the credibility of the underlying data. When I present this paper to real China experts like Andy and Jean, who know the workings of the Chinese bureaucracy, they're quite skeptical that this data will actually be compiled reliably and then disseminated. On the second point, I suppose you could say it's not surprising that politically connected firms are scoring higher in this system. But I think what's interesting or potentially important about this system is the behavior modification potential of the system. So these scoring categories can always be tweaked by the government to nudge companies to follow whatever the industrial policy is or party policy. And so I think this is really just a first glimpse at what this system will look like. And so we'll have to wait until it's rolled out nationwide and we have nationwide availability of data to see how all this plays out. So I don't want to overemphasize these results because it's really just a snapshot at the beginning. But I think there's tremendous potential for this system to be a kind of digitized or a data-driven central planning system. And again, if that happens, Again, one questions how well China can continue to grow and innovate if people are managing for these, these metrics, which may or may not be important to actually running a business.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, because the categories of the data seems not very related with the government, those things, each standard, but finally it's really highly related with the government collected. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Yes.
My name is Michael Sun. I run a venture capital firm. I'm also a donor at Stanford. I'm just curious. So last night I saw that Xi Jinping of China met with a lot of Central Asian countries. They had a lot of communiques. Additionally, I just read Mr. Joe Biden, president, met with Prime Minister of Japan. They're at the G7. And when I go to the Nixon Library, I see Nixon's first visit to China, and also like what it takes for these world leaders to meet. So I'm just curious what it takes for the current president to meet with, let's say, Xi Jinping, or to go to Russia, to win the hearts and minds of the people over there.
Joe Biden is on the banned list for Russia, as is Ashley. And I'm Biden, his daughter, and Jill. And the reason I know that is I was on the same list that was tweeted out by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs at the same time. I don't know the Bidens, but I feel like we have this connection now. He's not going anytime soon. The last president to visit Russia, Trump did not go. Is that right? I don't remember Trump going. He went to Helsinki. He met him in Helsinki. Yeah. Putin in Helsinki. Was Obama, and I know our colleague. He is. I'm right. Yeah, he never went. He has been there, but he never went as president. So Obama went, and I know our colleague Mike McFaul was working in the National Security Council at the time and was very, very involved in that visit. So, and he made a point, and this just shows you how different Russia was then as opposed to now, of meeting with civil society actors who could still function. Those people have all been driven out of the country now. So I think it'll be a very, very, very long time before an American president goes to the Kremlin to visit. Yeah. I can't comment on the others.
Maybe I can just interject a question here. I've spent some time at Singapore Management University, and one of the things I did was read the 2 massive volumes of Lee Kuan Yew's autobiography, which I was recommended to understand Singapore's history. Is the difference between Singapore and all of these other countries? It's extraordinarily clean bureaucracy. They got rid of corruption very effectively. There's only two jurisdictions in the world that have gotten rid of corruption very, very quickly. One is Hong Kong under the British, and the other is Singapore. They did not do it through democracy. They did it through kind of an autocratic mechanism where you had to prove that the money you had was earned legally. Is that one of the key differences? Of course, Russia and China, we can't apply that metric at all.
They don't want to get rid of corruption in Russia.
Well,
yeah.
China says it does, but...
Yeah.
Well, I think, is that for me?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm just curious.
I think Singapore would have turned out differently if they got a guy by the name of Robert Mugabe in the 50s, right? Mm-hmm. And I think it's sort of like an event of serendipity that Singapore got somebody like Lee Kuan Yew, who had the right combination of guts, heart, and brains.
Yeah.
I mean, he could have been the most successful lawyer in London or New York, but instead he chose to go back and help with the union leaders and union members for free. And I think he's been very consistent in projecting his idea of what the nation should be. Mm-hmm. Like, and to be able to find somebody like him, I think, you got to be serendipitous.
Yeah.
We can point to a country where the institutions are somewhat sophisticated, but you still end up with a leadership that's perhaps not as sophisticated. And you go to a place where the institutions are not sophisticated at all, but you end up with a leadership that's very visionary, sophisticated, and all the stuff you want to be in a leadership. So yes, he did it by eradicating corruption, but I think he had the structural qualifications to pursue. And he was able to consolidate the politics of Singapore, I think, at a very opportune time. At that time, he had the common enemy of communism, right, which most other Southeast Asian countries had to confront. And he used that to basically unify and unite the people of Singapore and consolidate the People's Action Party. That's just one possible explanation.
Yeah. But Lee Kuan Yew's in the middle of that explanation. Yeah, please.
Oh, yeah. I have some comment, not a general and a question. I was here yesterday and today. This you're talking is very interesting. All the speakers are good. I have some experience for attending so many different conferences. I'm 85 already, so I have attending all the different nations. But so I saw this morning, 3 of you. The first speaker with a very good talk and also a few graphs. And you put your ideas in the lines, right, so we can read it. The second speaker, go to the speakers on podium. Let us see you how to act. So you don't have anything to show, but you do. The third speaker sitting there. He talked the most interesting thing. But if he had been there, I guess it's more effective because you have a lot of experience. So what I suggest is that in this situation, international conference like that, the best way is go there, use the podium. Next time, if you write some field graph, even better. So that's my experience. I've been attending so many international conferences. I've been in Stanford for 10 years, watching it. That's my suggestion.
Okay. You've received your grades.
To relax. 3 different models. Okay.
I didn't want to stand up because I didn't want to look like I was lecturing you guys. Mm-hmm. I wanted to do it the Asian way.
No one commented on his TikTok control.
Yeah. We have about 3 minutes left. I thought I'd just throw a little hand grenade on the floor to close. I was asked, I gave a lecture, I lecture, the last 6 years I've lectured at the Schwarzman College at Tsinghua University, which is set up to be something like a Rhodes Scholarship for Asia. And in one of my lectures, I was describing the Chinese political system, the network of party organizations, and how it related to the economy, so some of the things that Curtis was talking about. And I got an unexpected, and it's a mixed audience of, about 25% of the students were Chinese, and there's a camera in the room, so we're not quite sure whether it's being used or not. They say it isn't, but I'm not sure. And the question I got was really quite surprising and unwelcome. A American student who graduated from a military academy said, "Professor, how is this different from fascism?" And I was not, and I think I mumbled something about mass mobilization and a quip about black leather. But I found it, I've thought about this a lot, especially when thinking about the way they're injecting party cells into private companies. And it's hard, maybe there's a book on the Third Reich and business, but it's hard for me to the term fascism has a lot of loadings that, it didn't necessarily have to have in Europe, but I don't know how to answer that question. I'm not asking you to answer it, but this is not the first time that there's been a challenge to democratic governance. Nazi Germany pulled the German economy through the Depression in a heroic fashion and had a lot of admirers in the United States. So this is something that kind of bothers me, and I try not to think about this too much, but it's pretty easy in the case of Russia to make that parallel.
Mm-hmm.
You're looking at me, Andy.
I'm looking at you, yeah. You're
well,
a lawyer.
Authoritarians have been capable of tremendous economic growth. It can happen. It doesn't typically happen because they tend to be miserable at all aspects of governance. But economic growth has taken place under authoritarian regimes. The Chinese have been somehow masterful at it. And I think the question I tried to pose here is, they've been obviously what I called Chinese state capitalism 1.0 has focused on national champion state ownership, has been remarkably successful. Question whether in an increasingly globalized world where data is so important, where innovation is so important, high tech, will what I'm calling Chinese state capitalism 2.0 continue to be as successful? I wouldn't necessarily bet against China. If you'd bet against China for the last 20 years, you'd have been wrong. But it's going to take a different style of governance, I think, to pull this off. But time will tell.
Okay. So I guess our time is up. Thank you. All three of you did a great job with this very open-ended title for the panel. Thank you.